Hello and welcome to episode 4 of the virtual tour of Syria 2020. My name is Janice Kortkamp. On this episode, we're virtually going to be on a bus ride heading out of Damascus, making our way to Homs. But this episode is dealing with the other side of visiting Damascus during the war. I've spent the last 3 episodes describing just the tiniest percentage of the wonderful times that I and others have had there. The wonderful hotels, the amazing, beautiful city of Damascus itself with all its sights, and just so many good times there. But this episode is going to be dealing with what the other side, if you will, of visiting a place in a war. And so typically on the bus ride, you spend many hours after hour riding on the bus together, and it's a good time to have some in-depth talks and for people to ask questions. So this is, the difficult part of having been in Damascus throughout the course of the war. So I hope you'll stay with me and keep watching this video. Thank you. Now, you've seen some of the beautiful scenes of the old city of Damascus and enjoyed the nightlife in episodes 1, 2, and 3. This is a typical view of what you would see wandering around the old city, the shops, the restaurants, the cafes, etc. Now, during the war, up until the end of 2018, Damascus was under fire, and it was under attack on a constant basis by these groups that the U.S. media and government, the other Western governments and media were telling you were, quote, moderate rebels, unquote. At one point, the city was completely surrounded. Suburbs had been totally taken over by these armed groups. And what would happen is the armed groups that set up within their neighborhoods what journalist Max Blumenthal called, mini Saudi Arabias. In other words, these groups were all fundamentalist, religious in nature. Usually, I think in every case, a harsh interpretation of Sharia law was imposed on the people. Women were forced to be fully covered. They could not dress like you saw in my earlier videos that women can in Damascus very freely. Children were often prohibited from going to school, or they could only attend religious schooling. The penalties for any perceived crime, whether it's a woman caught in adultery or sorcery or what have you, could be dealt with, with literal execution in the street. This was fairly common. And so these mini caliphates kind of sprang up all around Damascus, and their intent was to take over the entirety of the city so they would be able to take over, the government and take control of the country. And so on a regular basis, groups from these suburbs that had been captured would fire mortars, rockets into the civilian areas of the city. They would kidnap people on the street in raids. They would send in suicide bombers and car bombers, all of the things that, people associate with terrorism is what these groups were engaged in against the civilians that were still living under the control of the Syrian government in Damascus. Now, this attack was particularly heinous because one of the quote-unquote moderate rebels, a father of 2 young girls, had sent one of his young daughters, who was about 9 years old, to do a suicide bombing attack in a police station in Damascus, and he had strapped the explosives to her and covered them up with her clothing. She went to the police station saying that she had lost her parents and didn't know what to do, and the head of the police station, based on the reports I've heard from a reliable source, actually called his wife up and said, you know, there's this little girl, we can't find her parents, I might be bringing her home tonight to take care of her until we find her parents. Now, according to those reports, she went into the restroom of the police station, and apparently she either detonated herself there or was remotely detonated. She died. No one else died in that attack because she had gone into the bathroom. So we're not really sure if she had realized what was going on or what exactly happened, but it was a terrible tragedy. And what happens when, you know, you're fighting against forces that are extremists and have this terrorist ideology. So oftentimes while I was staying in Damascus, these kind of attacks would be going on. Car bombs were common, IEDs, improvised explosive devices placed in buses were common, suicide bombers sometimes, though more rare, and the constant mortar and rocket attacks fired into the city by these so-called rebel groups. Now, I never brought anyone into Syria in one of the group tours who I was not convinced was not fully aware of the dangers of being in Syria at that time. And, you know, these are dangers that it is impossible to guard against. They had been significantly reduced by my first trip there in May of 2016, thanks to the efforts of the Syrian army and their setting up of checkpoints, checking the vehicles for bombs, suspicious people, things like that. But, you know, they can't guard you against mortar and rocket attacks, for example. You know, the one thing that was far less common since I started going were the kidnappings, which in the early part of the war were on a horrific scale. And in fact, the armed groups had captured tens of thousands of civilians around Syria to use for human shields, to use for labor digging tunnels and things like that, for prisoner swap deals, for also for people to use to stage these so-called chemical weapons attacks. And we'll get more into detail into those allegations here in a little bit. But I wanted to explain some of the attacks that I was there for, and, you know, just from my personal experience. So here we go. This is one of those beautiful old shops right around the corner from where I was staying at the time. When the groups are gone, I rent a room from a friend of mine who has a house there in Old Damascus for $15 a night. And like I said, this is right around the corner from that. A mortar had fallen near this shop, right on the outside of the shop, killed the store owner and one of the customers. This was in one of the days when the mortar attacks were pretty constant. Oftentimes when I was in Damascus, there would be one or more a day. And, you know, this was, I know the shop well, and it was heartbreaking to see this. This is not my photograph. This is from someone who was on the scene at the time. This was another day when I was taking a nap at Beit al-Wali, which I showed you in the earlier episodes, and was awakened by a huge explosion, huge boom, and the bed shaking, and I knew that whatever it had hit close by. After the attack was over, I went out to investigate what had happened, and found that it had hit this little school that's owned by the building's owned by the nuns, and it's run by someone else, but it's a little school running classes for kids from kindergarten through 12th grade. And you can see how the mortar went through the roof of the school. Thankfully, no children were there at the time, and no one was hurt. But you see that tiny little hole, and it just doesn't look like much, does it? But what people don't understand is each of those mortars are filled with shrapnel. And the shrapnel, it explodes when it hits, and that shrapnel can cut people's legs off. It just cuts right through human flesh. And, for each one of these mortar attacks, for example, in one instance in a cafe in old Damascus, like I was showing you in the earlier episodes, a mortar went through the roof of a cafe and killed 8 people. And in that explosion, the sister of a friend of mine was killed, and her sister's young baby was killed. And they were out celebrating by enjoying a meal at the cafe, and they were both killed by the shrapnel from the mortar. So it may not look very impressive, but these mortars are incredibly deadly, and they're terrifying because you don't know where they're going to hit. And they've hit schools, playgrounds, businesses, of course, homes, office buildings, hotels. They're just kind of random acts of terror against the civilians in Damascus. Now, I've talked about these armed groups. In addition to creating these mini Saudi Arabia-style mini caliphates or areas under their control, part of that, of course, was driving out religious minorities. And so that, it went on a spectrum of extremism. So you had groups that were very similar to ISIS. You had that literally were targeting religious minority sects like the Alawites, the Christians, the traditional Shiites, for outright execution or dislocation. So they would take over their homes, they would force those people out. Oftentimes they would kill them outright, or there were other groups that were less extreme that would just make life very uncomfortable for religious minorities. So for example, there were churches all over Damascus and all over much of Syria, thousands upon thousands of churches. But if a church was in their area, they would usually have to take down any external symbolism. So the crosses would have to come down, from the top of the building or outside. Women weren't allowed to wear their crosses. Of course, all the women, like I said, had to be fully covered. Doesn't mean necessarily in a full burqa like you might think of Saudi Arabia, where you can just see your eyes. But they had to cover their hair, wear long sleeves, long pants, or long coat, and that sort of thing. So religious minorities were at the very least made uncomfortable and often persecuted if they were not outright targeted for death and dislocation from their homes. So Sid and I live about an hour and a half outside of Washington, D.C., and it's easy for me to imagine the various suburbs that surround that capital city being under control of these terrorist armed groups that are constantly attacking civilians within the city. And, the people of America would demand that these groups that this violence be stopped. I wanted to tell you that before the war, up until 2011, Syria was known as one of the 5 safest countries in the world, and they were called that by the UN, and from Gallup polls, these kinds of crimes were non-existent in Syria prior to 2011. Women could walk down the street all times of the day and night, never be accosted or fearful. I had one friend tell me how he and his family left for a week for vacation. They forgot to lock their house and nothing had been disturbed or anything while they were gone. You know, it was a very, very safe place to live. And it is, as I said before, a place of great religious diversity where all of the groups were protected and respected under the Constitution, under the government of Syria, and women were empowered. Few people know that Syria has a woman as the vice president, and they are at every aspect, in every aspect of society, at every level, from generals in the army to you know, owners of businesses and factories and artists and dancers and all of these things. All of this was under direct, immediate threat by these armed groups that were taking over the city. And this is what the Syrian government and the Syrian army and the great majority of the Syrian people have been fighting against for the past 9.5 years. Now, this is one of those suburbs that was taken over that people in the West heard a lot about on the news. This is the big area of the eastern part of Ghouta. It's a huge suburb right out on the outskirts of Damascus. It's about, a 1.5 kilometers away from Beit al-Wali, my hotel in Old Damascus. And it had been taken over by these armed groups, and this was one of the main areas where these terrorist attacks were constantly coming from. And eventually, in 2018, those groups were fully defeated by the Syrian army and their allies, and the area liberated. Now you can see that there's a great deal of destruction that occurred. This was a combination of destruction that had happened over time, because often the armed groups were literally missioned with destroying the infrastructure, and I'll talk about that as we get to other areas of Syria later on in this trip. And of course, it had happened with airstrikes from the Syrian army and the fighting between the groups. But as soon as this area was liberated, Syria, Damascus was basically free then from all these terrorist attacks, and this was basically the last area that needed liberating. Now, that area that you just saw in the video was where, you know, the so-called latest chemical weapons attack occurred. Now, all of us who have been following Syria day by day, hour by hour, year by year, will just tell you that those allegations of chemical weapons use by the Syrian government are the most obvious frame jobs that you can possibly imagine. If you think back on, you know, the allegations of the WMDs in Iraq, the hoax about the incubator babies in Kuwait, the nonsensical stories of Colonel Gaddafi, you know, feeding his army Viagra so they could rape more women. These are myths that are created in order to get good-willed American people and others to support very bad policies in these countries, in these conflicts. So, for example, in that area, eastern Ghouta, as I said, those were terrorist groups that had taken over those areas, and, you know, they simply knew that if they could make a video that made it look like there was a chemical weapons attack, then they would most likely get a free bombing from the United States government in supposed retaliation. Now, it's important for people to understand that the only WMDs that were discovered in Iraq post the invasion were these many decades old remains of chemical weapons there. And we knew Saddam Hussein had those chemical weapons because, in fact, in the late 1980s, the CIA had helped him obtain those. And this you can read about. The CIA files prove that, and this was actually written in Foreign Policy magazine, that the CIA assisted Saddam Hussein in obtaining those chemical weapons in order to use them to gas the people of Iran during that war. So if you have to stop thinking that anyone who understands what strategies and policies and actions really are versus, oh, Janice, you have your tinfoil hat conspiracy theorist hat on. Conspiracies are why nations have intelligence agencies. Theoretically, it's to fight against them, but they're just as often involved in creating them. They happen on a routine basis. This is what forms the backbone of much of particularly postmodern warfare and geopolitics. And so, you have to create a justification for your aggression against a country that is not and has never been any threat to your own. So how do you get people so angry that they're willing to support terrorists like Al-Qaeda and ISIS groups against a non-belligerent, non-threatening country that only, in fact, wanted mutually beneficial relations with the United States and the rest of the West? And this is how you do it. You create these provocations and these frame jobs. They're called false flags in order to do that. And that's what these chemical weapons attack allegations have been. So all that leads to this picture, which is taken not by me. These next few photos are not my own, but I was there when the U.S., U.K., and France decided to bomb in Damascus and elsewhere in Syria in retaliation, they said, for the so-called chemical weapons attacks that happened in that eastern Ghouta area, the Douma area of that neighborhood, of those suburbs. And it was the first night of our stay in Syria, and we had had one of those wonderful evenings like I described in episode 2, enjoying the nightlife there. I was sleeping soundly, just like a baby, and was awakened at about 4-ish in the morning by one of the group members pounding on my door. And when I got up to answer it, he said, Jan, the U.S. is bombing us. And, at that point, I could then hear the booms going on not very far, a few kilometers maybe, from where we were staying in the hotel. And, being there was a very profound moment. I wasn't really nervous or afraid because I knew it would most likely be some kind of targeted, limited attack. But, it was a major event to witness. And what's even more important was witnessing the reaction to the Damascenes, the people of Damascus, to these attacks. Many of them were actually on their rooftops watching the attack, some of them drinking beer and some drinking their tea. And, a lot of them were shouting curses and expletives at Donald Trump and the leaders of the UK and France. Just in this anger at them for doing this against their country. Many of them were saying, just bring it on. We're so sick and tired of the constant threats that you are going to come and attack our country. Just bring it on. We're ready to fight you. Just come on and do it already and stop talking about it. We're sick of your threats all these years of you doing this to our country. Just come on and act, they're just so tired of it. So this was the reaction on the ground to these attacks. And, you know, again, this was a totally faked chemical weapons attack in the first place. This bombing, this missile attack against Damascus, completely unjustifiable and done out of just total blind aggression against the Syrian state, the sovereignty of the Syrian state. You can imagine, again, if all of a sudden there were incoming missiles into Washington, D.C. from Russia and China, what the reaction of people in America would be. And this is the reaction that you would expect from any population when their country is under attack, and that's exactly what happened. Now, as we are winding down this talk, I wanted to show you the center, an IDP center, Internally Displaced Persons Center, for the civilians that were evacuated out of eastern Ghouta and that whole area as it was being liberated, and after it had been liberated, and the Syrian army and the Russian army and their allies go into these areas and, you know, try to get rid of all the mines and the booby traps that have been left behind by the terrorists, and to clean up the area, to make repairs and that sort of thing. And the people were taken to this refugee center, and the group I was with at the time and I got to go visit. Like I said, I've been to many of these around Syria. Now, in these centers, the children began attending school again, boys and girls. Often girls were not allowed to attend any kind of school when they lived under the terrorists. They are given wonderful meals. They cook in this kitchen, you know, chickpeas and other healthy things. And, you know, there's just this sense of relief that this is all over. And, you know, so for example, not only are the kids not allowed to go to school, but everybody living in the area, their identification papers were taken by the terrorists and replaced by, you know, so-called identification papers for their little mini caliphate thing. They were often not allowed to leave, so especially what happens when the Syrian army said they are going to liberate a place, they make sure people know it, and they make these corridors, safety corridors for civilians to leave the area before the heavy fighting begins. But oftentimes, like what happened here outside of Damascus and Aleppo and other places, the terrorists that control those areas literally using snipers, you know, shoot people trying to leave. And so it's this really terrible situation. Many civilians do get trapped and they do get hurt, and this is a reality of war, and it's a horrible reality, and nobody wants to see that. But obviously, as I was just explaining, you cannot have your capital city or any of your people surrounded by these various terrorist groups who are continually attacking your people. And this is the common misnomer, this is the basic narrative that is so completely false about the war in Syria, is that it's a civil war, what have you. What it is a sovereign, independent nation state that has been defending its country, its people, and its territory from these various armed groups that have been sponsored, armed, trained, and funded by outside aggressive governments who want to take it over for their own interests. And we'll end this talk on our virtual bus trip as we head north outside of Damascus with this scene, which is a very common sight around the country, and these are the pictures of the martyrs. Martyr makes Westerners uncomfortable as a word, but in this context, these are the men and women who have died defending their country from these various armed terrorist groups that had held their country under siege for all these years. There are still these groups operating in areas, and we'll talk about that as we get further into our trip. But around Damascus, thank God, they have been defeated, and now most of the army checkpoints are gone. People go about their days without any fear of a mortar attack or a rocket attack. There are sometimes an occasional act of violence, but compared to what it was like in those days before the end of 2018, it's night and day as far as safety goes. And that's all due to the men of the Syrian Arab Army, the soldiers of the Syrian Arab Army, as they have liberated these areas one by one. And, you know, the families put up posters of their sons or fathers or brothers who have died fighting in the war. And like I said, these posters are everywhere. And it just shows you that, you know, Syria really has bled out defeating these various terrorist groups, and this is why the army is held in such high esteem by, you know, the great majority of the people there, because they've seen these sacrifices that have been made on their behalf. And so we're going to end this part, this talk here. And I look forward to episode 5, where we will be visiting the beautiful areas of Malula and Sednaya on our way to Homs. Have a good night.